And we are live. Welcome to the first ever episode of Coddcast for All Men Do Despise Us. My name is Kyle Harwick. I'm joined here today by Jesse Eisenberg. Jesse, how you doing?
It's Will Eisenberg. Jesse
Oh
Eisenberg is the
shit.
dude from the movies, but I'm
Oh
doing
man.
good, man.
Oh god.
That's okay.
Already messed it up.
I'm just happy there's finally a famous Eisenberg.
My mind is not on this podcast right now. We'll get to that later after the episode that just happened. Um, but yeah, so we're going to talk about everything Game of Thrones that has happened over the past 5 weeks. We'll talk about John, that whole situation, talk about Tyrion and Marine, Arya's whole thing in the House of Black and White. Um, we'll talk about everything that's happened. Um, this is a good start. um, so, Will, John's alive. How do you feel about that?
It feels like the sort of the end of a long inevitable road that we've been headed down for a pretty long time. Um, I mean, for both of us as book readers, it's been, oh, what is it, five years, 4 years now?
Yeah, it's been roughly 5 years. Yeah.
And yeah, like the first thing that went through my mind as I finished Dance with Dragons was like, oh yeah, John's coming back, whether it's through warging through to Ghost or being revived by Melisandre. It was something that I was expecting. I think the thing that surprised me most about it when it finally happened was how much John is pretty much himself. I think a lot of us expected him to come back changed in some really significant ways.
Yeah, and I think that's what the show and George have been setting up for a very long time is that uh, when you do come back, in the case of Beric Dondarrion, he seemed like he was a changed man. And especially with Lady Stoneheart, she had been dead for, I think, 3 or 4 days by the time they got to her. And
Mm-hmm.
she was completely changed. She became a very kind of evil Catelyn. So I was kind of surprised to see him roughly the same. I think maybe the old John might have uh, looked at Ollie's transgressions and maybe not have killed him. So I think he's a little more, uh, I guess the word's like vengeful. That
Sure,
he,
I mean, he
he
definitely seems to be affected by the experience of having been killed, which I think is obvious. But like
Mhm.
you said, we see a lot of the characters in Martin's work who die and come back tend to be sort of turned into sort of this one emotion, all-consuming thing. And I think the fact that John is back and you know whatever he's been through, however he's changed, he's back and he still is John. I think that just goes to show that he's going to be a transformational character in the world. Like it means he has more things to do. And so
Right.
he's back, and that means, like at this point, he looks like he's trying to walk away and he's so upset with everything. He's definitely at the point in the hero's journey of sort of rejecting the call is what they always call that step where, it's the moment of inner crisis or whatever. So I think, we're going to see John move through that and assume his destiny.
Right. And I think he is very kind of not welcoming this whole thing. Like he was dead. And
Yeah,
to him,
reasonably.
yeah. And to him, he thinks, oh, I should have stayed dead, you know? And I think what he's most shaken by and what most people should be most shaken by is he was dead for probably a day. And she asked him what he saw, and he said he saw nothing.
Right.
He remembers nothing. So I think he would be shaken by that. He wouldn't want to just go directly back to war and die again because he knows what's beyond death, which is what everyone fears is nothing.
Right.
Um, and so I think he will show more changes. I hope. If not, it's kind of sloppy writing by the showrunners and by all the writers on the staff. Um, even even though this has been probably one of the most solid seasons so far, there have
Hmm.
been some things that I questioned, like why Davos would want to bring John back to life. That never really made sense to me.
Right.
And I was actually hoping you could reflect on that because Davos wants usually nothing to do with black magic. Why would he suddenly, change his character and want to bring Jon back to life?
Right. Did he ask Melisandre to do it? I'm trying to
He
remember.
said, "Do you have a way we can bring him back?" Basically.
Yeah. No, I think it's just the writers tend to use the characters that they have at hand, and I don't think that they sometimes have a rough hand in the way that they do things. And so I think that's just one of those things where
Right.
Davos is one of the good guys, more or less, and so he's who was in that camp that they had up the wall to be on Jon's side. But I don't know necessarily that he would be doing that in the
Yeah.
books. Yeah,
And I think, there are going to be more characters in the books. Obviously, there are so many characters in the books that aren't in the show at all.
right.
There are plenty of dead characters in the show that are still alive in the books that may be meeting their fate soon. But we'll have to wait for the Winds of Winter and see it.
Nice
Kind of,
name drop to the Winds of Winter in the episode today. If you caught it during the
yeah, I
little
did.
during the little
Yeah,
play,
during the
that was
Arya
great.
scene, that was nice.
Yeah.
I kind of smirked at that. Um, we'll move on to what I think no one ever thought was going to happen, which is the Sansa and Jon reunion,
Yeah.
specifically because they had never had a scene together in the show. What were your emotions behind that? That was probably the happiest moment in Game of Thrones ever. It was probably the only happy moment in Game of Thrones.
I was sort of skeptical going into it. Like, I could see the episode was coming. Oh, okay. I guess Jon and Sansa are going to meet. And then I was thinking on it, and I was like, well, they didn't really like each other when they knew each other. They didn't really get along. So, like, how, Sansa really, took to her mother. And so she took from her mother the attitude of really being distant towards Jon. But the fact that they, sort of addressed it when they talked and sort of made up over childish notions was, I found it pretty touching, this scene, and I wasn't expecting to, so I thought it was pretty well written on their part.
I think for both of them, they were just happy to see someone who was blood at that point
Right.
because they had both been through hell. Sansa getting beaten and raped and tortured by Ramsay, having to deal with Joffrey for months on end, and
Mm-hmm.
then Jon dying. I mean,
Yeah.
they had both been through hell, so it was good to. I think it was good for them to see each other. I think it was a little rushed at times, but you only have 10 hours per season, so you have to kind of rush things at points.
It was nice to see some
um,
Starks see each other for once. I mean,
yeah,
the obviously Jon and Arya is the sort of long awaited for reunion, that may or may not ever come because both of those characters have been through so much that, what's going to be left of them by the time that they meet each other again. But yeah, I thought it was a really nice moment, in a series that, is increasingly not willing to give out a nice moment ever.
yeah, there for every nice moment there's 10 to 15 really horrible moments, um, which we'll talk about a lot of those later because there have been quite a few this season where we're just shaking our heads at them.
Yeah.
um, Next thing I had on my script, I'm going to actually flop with something else. I want to talk about Arya since you had mentioned
Hmm.
her and John's reunion. What's the deal with Arya right now? I mean, she's looking like she's going to become no one, but we all know she has to kind of make her way back to Westeros at some point. Um, what's the deal? Basically, is I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think being a faceless man or a faceless woman, I don't know what the terminology would be necessarily, but
Faceless girl.
yeah, it's certainly. I mean, you could see how she gets back to Westeros from that position. She gets a contract, you know, on John or something, or a contract on some other Stark, and is sent to Winterfell or wherever to kill them, and so you can see that thing sort of unfolding. I mean, I guess the question is, Arya's journey is sort of one of changing identities, right? So even before the House of Black and White, she's the servant girl, or she's Ari on the road, she's the boy. with the traveling prisoners. And so it's all these going through these different identities and more losing herself. So I guess the ultimate question of Arya's journey is, does she really end up as nobody, or is there something really left? And the episode tonight seems to suggest like, well, she's still Arya, at least at this point. Like, no matter what she does, as much as she can say, a girl desires nothing, it's still pretty obvious that she's Arya Stark deep
Right.
down.
And I think this is the most Arya we've seen in a long time with that play scene that they were doing, which why they were doing that I don't know, but when she saw that her father was being portrayed as an idiot and Joffrey was being portrayed as a hero, I think she really took that to heart rather than no one would think nothing of that.
Right. Yeah, she's not particularly good at at hiding her emotions on that sort of thing.
And I think that kind of speaks to kind of the idiots at the House of Black and White who are taking in this really angsty, emotional girl, who Jaqen had seen this entire time was very just quick to judge things and kind of anger a tiny little ball of anger and take her into a position where you can't really have any emotions or any identity. It's kind of baffling me, honestly. Like, what do they want of her? And another thing I do want to speak on is that when someone, at least in the books, I don't know if they've mentioned it in the show at all, but when a target is acquired for the Faceless Man, the person who does the killing of that person can't have any ties to them. They can't know them.
Right.
It's kind of the main question is like if the show decides to go that she's going to get a target on John, then that's fine. But if the book does it, then George's kind of contradicting himself. So we'll have to see. That could be a major difference between book and show there.
Yeah, that would definitely, I mean, it would have to be addressed in some way. I mean, I guess the idea is that you recuse yourself from the role if you're put under a contract of somebody that you know. Uh,
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see if she would just kind of say, "Yeah, I know this person. Someone else has to kill them," or if she would say the same thing, or tell them, "Yeah, I don't know who that is," and then go and not kill them and help them out essentially,
right.
or go kill the person who issued the target.
It's interesting because it seems like whatever's going to happen has to happen relatively quickly because everything is happening so quickly now. All the pieces are being brought into place. It's like everybody's got to take their place on the stage for the final showdown.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, I feel like they are rushing it, even though they say they have two more seasons left in them. Whether those are going to be shorter seasons or not is up to interpretation and obviously what we'll see in the future. Um, Moving on though from the Starks for a while, we will get back to them. I do want to talk about Tyrion and what he's up to in Marine. Seems like he's making some pretty good judgment calls there without Dany. She's off, God knows where to them, on Drogon's back doing dragon things. Um, and he's just kind of trying to hold the peace after their ships were burned and people are being openly killed in the streets. Um, I kind of want to ask you, is Tyrion making enemies within Dany's council, or is he doing what Dany would end up to be doing?
Well, I think it's a little of both, right? Because I think he's doing. I mean, I love Tyrion in this role, right? I mean, I think the best Tyrion is like Tyrion is Hand of the King, or anytime that Tyrion has some kind of power but is not really like overtly in charge, it's pretty enjoyable because I feel like he naturally falls into that role pretty well. So I think he's making some shrewd moves as completely unelected, unexpected ruler of Marine. Not entirely sure how that came to pass, except by just like sheer force of charisma. Um, but yeah, I think everybody in Dany's gang, from Marine to the people who are actually with Dany, are such passionately, emotionally motivated characters that they all have their own little narrative, their own set of goals, and if Tyrion's doesn't line up with theirs, then I think even if he's doing exactly what Daenerys would have done as a ruler, he can still be making a few enemies along the way. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. Just the way that Grey Worm and Missandei kind of looked at him. They looked at him with a lot of not hate. Hate is not the right word, but I would think disgust because he was making a deal with the slavers and they'd grown up slaves and were raped and mutilated and beaten by these people. And so I think they're not on board with it entirely. But until Danny gets back and tells them, hey, he's fine, this is probably a good call, then they'll just kind of have that resentment towards him. And as long as he has Varys with there, I think with there with them, he'll be fine. But um, we'll have to see what happens there, especially with the Red Priestess that they just brought in tonight.
Yeah, Varys getting a nice little bit of backstory that's also in the books,
Mm-hmm.
established a little bit tonight with his childhood and hearing the voices and the flames. And I don't know, do you have theories on what's going on exactly with that?
I know they did have a scene of that in season 2 where he told that story to Tyrion
Oh, yeah, okay.
when he was opening the crate with the guy. He found the sorcerer.
Right.
Um, so it was a nice callback. I'm sure a lot of show watchers completely forgot about that.
Yeah, I
It'll be
forgot that it was
interesting.
on the show, so.
Yeah, yeah. It was verbatim in the show too, which was nice, and
Gotcha.
that may be why you forgot, just because of how
Right.
awesome they portrayed it. But um, yeah, it was a nice callback, and how she knew that is beyond me. I have no idea how she would know that.
The Red Priests always have something going on. They always
Yeah,
know something that they shouldn't.
yeah. So it'll be interesting to see if that gets used against them again in the future. And what the voice said and who the
Yeah,
voice was.
I'm
If
curious what the deal is with that.
Yeah, if we ever find that out, I think that's a huge step forward in me believing that R'hllor is real, because I'm still very skeptical at this point.
Varys has some impressive informants to know what's going on with Stannis, by the way.
Oh yeah,
Like
yeah,
from it's just the sheer thought of how you get information from like Winterfell to White Harbor to Bravos to somewhere else in Essos to Marine is like just staggeringly hilarious to me.
and it kind of warps the timeline a lot too. So you have to think of what's going on in Marine happening several months after everything that's happening currently. His
I think everybody
informants.
pretty much just time travels in Game of This. Like information travels almost at the speed of light, and so does Littlefinger, who
Yeah,
basically just pops from scene to scene wherever he wants to be.
gives credence to the Weirwood net and to the glass candles and all that. That a lot of show watchers are like, "What is he talking about right now?" But yeah, gives credence to those and how messed up the Maesters are. At
It's
least
just funny
Maester
because you
Morrowind.
can have like a whole season of, Arya and the Hound traveling, or Arya and Brienne, and you go from, somewhere in the Riverlands up to the Vale, and Littlefinger can get from the Vale to Winterfell in the space of one episode, basically.
Yeah, and how Gilly's baby is like 3 months old. Yeah,
Yeah,
so the whole timelines are kind of, I think, luckily ambiguous for the showrunners right now.
I mean, it just makes things easier for them to not have to worry about that kind of stuff. And it's nice to have the realism and the preciseness of the books of, oh, it takes such and such a time to travel, and if a raven can't get there to deliver the information, then they don't have the information in that amount of time. But
Right.
yeah, just for the simplicity of the show, I think it's nice. Okay, this character is here now. Like, all right, that makes sense.
Yeah. So slightly moving on, but not exactly. I want to talk about Danny. Is Danny Azor Ahai confirmed now, or what do you think? Because of the whole resistant to flames thing that happened in episode 4.
Right, and that really bugged me because George R. R. Martin is specifically that the first time that she went through the pyre with the dragons is like a one-time thing. Danny is not resistant to fire.
Mhm.
And also, the first time it happened, her clothes didn't burn off, but the second time they did. Um, so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think John has a good a case as Danny for being the chosen one in my mind.
And I think a dark horse for Azor Ahai would be Tyrion, if you believe the whole his mother had a thing with one of the Targaryen kings, and that's why what's his name? His father.
So this
Yeah.
is the theory that Joanna Lannister cheated on Tywin
Yes.
with the Mad King.
Yep. And that's why Tyrion is so hated by Tywin. It's because he's not his actual son. But
Right.
that's kind of a crackpot theory to me. I'll just throw it out there just because
It's interesting.
any theory at this point is worth throwing out there. So
Yeah.
um, but yeah, like I thought the whole Danny thing was kind of confirmed that the Magi from season one, since she was on the pyre with her, that some of her magic went on to Danny, and Danny isn't actually immune to fire, but she thinks she is. So it'll be interesting to see what happens and how she gets the Dothraki across the sea, because we know it's going to happen.
Yeah, I would think so.
And we hope that the next person that we talk about doesn't influence her. And that is everything that happened in the Kingsmoot tonight, which was, I think, a scene that you and I were really looking forward to this season,
Mm-hmm.
especially with the addition of Theon to the Kingsmoot.
Right.
So let's talk about Euron and how he's just kind of the coolest motherfucker out there right now.
I actually have a completely different reaction to Euron. Um,
Ooh.
I'm just not buying the character. He doesn't have any charisma for me. I don't get it. Um, he's not menacing. He's not threatening or scary. I guess it seems like he tries to have this like roguishness to him. Um, but yeah, it's just not working. I don't know what it is about the lines or the actor or I mean the accent is weird to me, but just overall the whole character of Euron is so like imposing and so frightening in the books that when this sort of show version of Euron showed up, I was just a little put off by it. And he didn't have very many lines in the first time we saw him, but in the Kingsmoot tonight, I don't know. I wasn't feeling his vibe necessarily. So, but you like him.
Well, I feel like I should amend my statement because now that you said that, I feel that as well. But mostly I'm thinking the first scene that we saw him when he was on the bridge with Balon. I got the coolest vibe for him. You know, he said, "I am the sea, I am the drowned god," and I feel like that's what should have carried over into tonight's episode. That
Right.
whole kind of cockiness, and he was very ambiguous with why he was there, um, because he didn't kill Balon because he wanted to kill Balon. Balon attacked him and he threw him over the bridge. So he lied at the Kingsmoot. He said he came to kill Balon because he was done with it, but he just was standing on a bridge acting all weird. And Balon's like, "All right, I'm done with this dude." Pulls out a knife, which, you know, he just had for whatever reason,
Right.
and then decides to kill his brother, but his brother wasn't having it. So I think Euron will be an interesting character going forward. I did like his line. There was one line I really liked that he had tonight where he said, "Where are my niece and nephew? Let's go slaughter them," or something like that.
Yeah, it was like, let's go murder them, I think was the line.
Yeah.
That was, yeah, I mean, maybe he'll grow on me. I'd be curious to see what people who never read the books and didn't really have any expectations for that character coming in think. Because there's so
Hmm.
many things about that character that are so iconic in the book. Like his crew is all mute. He made everybody cut out their tongue, and his ship is named Silence. Like that's such a striking thing.
Yeah. It it's very forward, really. It's, you mess with me, I'm going to cut out your tongue and put you on my ship, um, type thing. And so I have very mixed feelings towards him. I will say, um, and it kind of kills the whole Dario is Euron theory that also floats the internet, which was my favorite thing before before Euron actually got cast. I was like, this could be real. The timelines moderately work out here. If you just assume that Silence is the fastest ship in all of the world.
Right.
Um, But yeah, it would be really neat if that were true, but obviously it is not.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty much the heaviest of tinfoil.
So let's talk about just the worst bit of Game of Thrones ever. Um, Carrying over from season 5 into season 6, the whole Dorne storyline was slaughtered. What do you see? I mean, it's impossible to predict, but what do you see going forward for Dorne? I don't even want to talk about what happened already because
Yeah,
it's
I
just
mean
bullshit.
that entire storyline has been just a mess on the part of the show. I don't think there's been anything in the show that they've done worse than Dorne. Um, as far as like, yeah, I don't even know what to say about them at this point. I mean, if the Crown can muster up any troops, then obviously they would declare war on Dorne. I don't know how many Lannister troops exactly exist at this point. I think Jamie's going to have to go do some of his sort of battlefield generalship in the Riverlands, and maybe once he resolves that and crushes some of the resistance in the west, then maybe the crown will move towards the south. But I mean, at this point, I don't know, like, are the Sand Snakes just running Dorne? Because that seems insane to me.
There are so many other houses in Dorne that you would think would be like, okay, well, this probably isn't cool, but they all seem to be okay with it. So it's like the Ironwoods and the Danes, they all just don't exist. It's now Sand Snake territory.
Right.
So I think I think going forward we can expect to see more Sand Snake action, talking about pussies and showing their tits and shit like that because the show needs more of that. I think they have a quota.
It'll be interesting to
I didn't.
see if they, strike some kind of an alliance with, Daenerys, or that's sort of, Dorne is one of the chips that the Targaryens would sort of count on as far as retaking the Seven Kingdoms, I think. Um,
Right. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they go that way with it. I thought they were gonna do the whole Dornish law thing and try to get Myrcella to be the queen, but they killed her,
right.
so that's not happening. And I didn't have this on the script, but we're kind of talking about it anyways.
Let's go for it.
The whole crown situation with Marjorie still in the dungeons
Right.
of who knows where. I think it's in the Sept, but it sounds like it's in the keep or whatever, the Red Keep. So it. So what do you think is going to happen with the High Sparrow? Who do you think the High Sparrow is, and what is his motive right now? What do you think his end goal is?
Well, I do like your little nod to. I used to think, or I used to subscribe to the theory that the High Sparrow is Howland Reed, because there are some pretty convincing passages about physical properties of Crannogmen and the High Sparrow in the book, and the High Sparrow is a character who kind of just comes out of nowhere, right? Like, he just kind of appears on the scene with all these followers and all this influence, and nobody really seems to know who he is in any way. So it's only natural, I think, that you would speculate about his background. Now, having seen him on the show, I don't think he is Howland Reed, probably. That'd be very unlikely. Um, yeah, it's been pretty weird on the show. He is a character who likes to kind of ramble on about his past and give these very long speeches that kind of tend to feel like filler. I don't know. Have you been enjoying his long
No,
speeches?
no, that's when I check Twitter. Honestly, like he can talk about how he left his house without even his shoes, but um, he's dull as hell, honestly. And it is very much filler at this point. I don't know if they know where they're going to go with that, or if they're just buying time until there's a huge conflict between the Tyrell army and the rest of the Sparrows, and Marjorie somehow dies because it's Game of Thrones and you have to kill one main character per episode.
Right.
So, um,
Yeah, it seems like he could be a way of sort of, just cleaning up the situation in King's Landing, as far as, it was so fractured between the Tyrells and the Lannisters that um, nobody was really able to assemble any kind of center of power there, and now having been united against a common foe, uh, the Lannisters and the Tyrells, who knows if they'll end up as allies again or if they'll be effective, but it'd be interesting to see, because they've really been out of the game as far as being able to marshal power in any way, because you know Cersei's been in captivity, Marjorie's been in captivity, the soldiers are pretty much scattered to the wind, Loras is almost dead, so it'd be interesting to see if they come back around and are, because they were once one of the biggest forces in the land, and now they're probably their lowest point.
Right. And it's interesting to see Loras be so weak since he's the future of the Tyrells because they kind of killed off his brothers. Um, and yeah, it's just to the theory that Tommen's going to die, which I do. To see if the Lannisters are going to be in power in another season or if it's going to be them and the Tyrells are basically nothing.
Right.
Um, moving on to what we probably should have let off with, but I think our emotions are still running from the episode. Um, let's go ahead and talk about Hold the Door.
Holy
We'll go
crap.
back to some other stuff, but what was what was your reaction to that? I cried. I bawled. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I was pretty floored by it. I didn't cry. I don't know. I don't tend to choke up too much at Game of Thrones. I've done for other shows and stuff, like probably like when Charlie died on Lost, is the one that comes to mind. Part of it is, I think, the whole sequence with the children of the forest and the walkers, some of the effects, like the fireball grenades and stuff, are like a little cheesy, and so that kind of took me out of it in a way that, like, the book, because you're just making it up in your own head, you're so engrossed in it, I think, would probably be more emotional for me. But the way that the scene unfolded at the very end with Hodor, was pretty incredibly done, I thought. And as I was reflecting on it, a way of sort of conveying all of that, uh, the past and the present going on at the same time, and giving you all that information in the midst of this big action chase scene was something that the books probably couldn't do. And so I give the show credit for doing that, because I thought it was pretty well done. It was a pretty incredible scene.
I think the show gets a lot of credit for that scene because not only did it explain how a character got, you know, their name and what they say repeatedly, but it also kind of let a theory come to light about time travel from the books and how Brand could have been going back in time and telling people these things. I think it was kind of confirmed tonight when Brand took control of Hodor or Willis in the past. He was hearing what was going on in the future, hold the door, and kept saying it until it just kind of meshed into Hodor. I think that unfortunately for us book readers, we're going to have to read this scene in the future because that's just too good of an explanation for Hodor's name that I don't think the show writers came up with it on their own. I think that George definitely told them how he wanted it to
Funnily
happen.
enough, it actually it is the same sort of linguistic process that I talked about in the article that I wrote for your site this week, right?
Yeah, good
Of
plug.
a
Good plug.
phrase sort of being degenerated. In this case, not over the course of generations, but over the course of just a couple minutes of him screaming it wildly. But I thought that actor did a pretty good job of making it seem, convincing. Like, yeah, that it made sense how that went from hold the door to Hodor.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, like I had never thought about that specifically. It kind of blew my mind, but I'm not surprised that he did that. That Hodor is some kind of a phrase that turned into, someone had suggested that maybe Hodor had seen something that scared him, or that Hodor was like the name of the great other or something. And I thought those were really cool theories too, and they were sort of on the right path. Uh, but yeah, I was totally blown away by it.
So the whole brand storyline has kind of been off the rails for what the rest of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones is you think it's all about who's going to have power in the kingdoms in the end, but really it's a very science fiction-y fantasy like conglomerate of, oh, there's these evil zombies that are going to take over the world, and there's a character who can time travel and affect the past and the future, and it kind of credence to the whole is Game of Thrones sci-fi question, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But I do want to keep talking about Bran for a second.
Yeah.
Is Bran your favorite scenes? Because he's kind of mine, and I was really upset when he was out of. I think what was it, like 2 seasons? He was complete. No, it was just,
Definitely a full season he was
yeah,
gone for.
yeah. I think it was the end of season 4. We saw the whole um, fight and Jojen getting stabbed, and then they ran into the Weirwood, and then we didn't see anything for a full season. Um, he's definitely has my favorite scenes just because we can see so much that we wouldn't be able to see with any other character. Um, and that battle scene at the end of season 4 is probably my favorite scene in Game of Thrones to date. So it's really nice to see it again later or tonight, even though it came at the cost of one of my favorite characters.
Right.
I was saying the whole time I was watching the episode, this is probably the best episode of Game of Thrones yet. Um, I think that brand scene at the end kind of confirms it for me. What do you think? Do you think that Game of Thrones is in a good position right now, or do you think it's kind of tapered off a little bit?
Well, I think that it's never going to be able to live up to the expectations that I've built for myself, having read the books. And I don't even know if the books will be able to do that, because you read these books and they're really incredible, and you build up these expectations about what the story is going to be and how it unfolds. And I've read probably tens of thousands of words of theories of what's going to happen, and loose threads that get tied up. And I don't think anything at this point could match my expectations. But as far as the show in and of itself as a thing, which it is for a lot of people, I think it's in a better place than it was last season. And it seems like they're going to do a perfectly good job of bringing about an end to this thing. And it's going to be well done, and it's going to be emotional, and it's going to be everything that viewers pretty much want. So I think personally, it's going to be a 10 out of 10 for me, just because I have too many, little cynical things in my mind that I have coming from the books, or just about the overall tone of the thing. But that's the direction that they've chosen to go on, and a lot of people really enjoy it. And I still watch the show and enjoy it a lot. So I'm not, knocking it. I'm just saying, it's never going to be this perfect thing for me. But yeah, I think this season has been really, every episode has been great, and I feel pretty confident that I will be okay watching D&D take this thing for a landing rather than George R. R. Martin, because I know I'll get the other version in the books later. But I'm pretty excited to see what the show does too.
Yeah, and you honestly summed up my opinion on it perfectly. I always get kind of knocked by one of my friends for, talking a lot about the show and how it's not doing as much as I thought it would be, and how it keeps like contradicting itself. But it's not because I don't love the show. It's just because I have unreasonable expectations for what it could be,
Yeah.
because uh, it's like the manifestation of one of my favorite book series of all time. So I think I think we're in a really good place for Game of Thrones, and I'm excited to see what the rest of this season brings, and how they can continue to improve on what they've built without a book to base things off of.
Speaking of the rest of the season and things that are built, one thing that I definitely think is going to happen is that the wall is going to come down. and I've thought this for a long time, but it was pretty much sealed 100% for me when John said to don't knock it down while I'm gone. I was like, all right, it's so going down, right?
So yeah, I had a theory posted on my timeline about this earlier, so I'm glad you brought it up. Someone read into the house words of House Stark, which is winter is coming,
Hmm.
summer, um,
Right?
who just died.
Just killed by the King of Winter, more or less.
Yeah, and what comes between summer and winter?
The fall,
The fall.
fall of the wall. Yeah, I
So
like that a lot.
the wall could fall. Um, And there's another theory that I just watched by Ideas of Ice and Fire, which is a nice shout out moment. If you don't subscribe to them, go check out his channel. He has a bunch of good ideas. But he basically made a theory that there are two walls. There's the wall in the north, which is called the wall. And there's a wall in the far east, um, right next to, I think it's the Gray Waste or something like that. Um, Protecting ET from the Gray Waste, and he theorizes that the North and the East are connected, and that it's a obviously circular planet,
Right.
so that there were White Walkers when the White Walkers attacked, and when the Long Night happened, it happened in both the East and in the North. Um, so that was a lot of work that he did there to read into the entire world of Ice and Fire, because that's
That's
not.
interesting. I think Martin has said specifically that the East doesn't wrap around. But he could be being coy. And I definitely think that there is something going on in the East that at least parallels the experience in the North of the Wall, with these the five what is it, five forts, five towers,
Yeah,
whatever. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, I mean, if anybody hasn't read The World of Ice and Fire, it's totally worth it, because it's very cool. And just looking at the maps and stuff is pretty awesome. So I highly recommend
And the thing that really sold me on that theory was he compared John and Danny to each other. How John is kind of, up in the north, and that's where the wall is, and Danny's in the east, and that's where this supposed other wall is. And then what really, really got me was when he brought out the Quaith line that she said to Danny, which was, to
it.
go
Right,
west, you have to go
go
east.
east. Yeah,
So that kind of sold it. It made me want to think about the theory more. I won't say, oh yeah, it's definitive, because nothing could be definitive at this point. They're all theories, but made me really, really led some credence to that theory.
well, if Euron's going to Danny, are they attempting to travel west to try to get to Marine?
It's possible. Depends on how crazy Euron is. He said he's seen the world, so maybe he, went east to get to the west.
Right, like it's a long way around to go from the Iron Islands to Marine.
Mhm.
But then again, Yara went from the Iron Islands all the way around and up in about the course of like one episode. So I guess they maybe could do it after all.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I really look forward to that, but that would be something that takes far planning from D&D and George to think about, and that's a huge secret to keep.
Yeah,
Um, so this is a nice transition, I think, into the question that I posed to you and was kind of posed by Preston Jacobs, which is one of my favorite YouTubers on A Game of Thrones and a Song of Ice and Fire in general. And he asks the question: is Game of Thrones sci-fi? And he brought up the furniture rule, which I think is one of the best rules that George has said himself, which is, you can have a sci-fi book in a fantasy world, but people judge what the book is based off of the furniture, meaning the setting, the characters, what they do. So I'm going to pose the
right.
question to you, Will. Is Game of Thrones sci-fi, and do you have a reason why or why not?
It's an interesting question. I think my take on it is that Martin is a science fiction writer at heart, um, and not necessarily a fantasy writer at heart. Um, and I think the implications of that are that he approaches his world building and the consistency of his world with the eye of a science fiction writer, that things have to fit together, they have to make sense, that magic will come from somewhere and have a cost and have consequences. So I think the sci-fi eye that he brings to it, um, has a lot of implications as far as, I think, everything in the world sort of fitting together into this broader meta narrative, which we saw a lot of in tonight's episode, as far as the revelations about, the children of the forest and the others. Like, it's just going to show that this entire micro story is actually really just part of a much, much broader, really history of the entire planet. And I think that's a very sort of science fiction-y way to think about things, because fantasy writers tend to approach pretty small situation, like a moment of time in a kingdom, and that's sort of where their stories are centered around. But guys who Martin admired, like Asimov, wrote stories about an entire universe and planets and characters and moments in time over the course of that, the entire galaxy and everything in it and how it affected everything. So I think, maybe Martin's coming in with that kind of eye. And I don't know that his entire world is going to be unified in all his different books. I don't know what you think about that, but I think, at least as far as the Song of Ice and Fire goes, they're like, yeah, I think with the science fiction eye, it's this really broad story that all really interlocks really in a really logical way.
I completely 100% agree with you. He definitely takes the approach of a fantasy novel, or a fantasy series, I should say, and puts it in the eye of a science fiction writer. I don't know if it was like an interview or what, but he was walking around his house with the actress who played Shay, which is weird in my opinion. But they were walking around his house, and he had some dragon figurines, and they had four legs and wings. And he was explaining to her that those aren't like the dragons in his books, because no creature on Earth has four legs and wings. So he's taking a very scientific approach to even the smallest thing like dragons. And he says most fantasy authors have their dragons have four legs and wings. And it's like, so is he not most fantasy authors? Because he's not. This is his first ever attempt in a fantasy series. He's written things about, worlds and hive-minded races, and
Right.
teleportation and telekinesis, and really, you have to read all of his works. And I know that's no easy task, because some of them are pretty out there, but um, you have to read all of his works to understand this one completely. You can't just think of it as A Song of Ice and Fire is independent of everything else, because everything he's ever written and everything he's ever read is influencing A Song of Ice and Fire, because there are no original ideas. You know, everything's based off of something else. I'm writing a book series currently with my best friend, and even though we have this pretty elegant magic system and all these awesome characters that do all this stuff, we're heavily influenced by Martin and Tolkien and Robert Jordan, um,
Right.
and all, even like Stephen King, because we've read them, we've watched things that are based off of their stories, and we just you are what you've seen. So since George is primarily a science fiction writer, I would primarily say that Game of Thrones is science fiction. um, and I was hoping to have a bit more of a discussion about this, but you and I kind of completely agree on it. We've come to the same conclusion. um, I guess the last question I have based off of is Game of Thrones science fiction? Will we ever see an explanation to some of these things, or is it going to be very ambiguous in the end?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and I was thinking about, with this question of science fiction, a sort of like another way to look at, if you're looking at Song of Ice and Fire as fantasy. Um, so there's sort of high fantasy and low fantasy, where high fantasy is sort of, high magic, unicorns and wizards. Low fantasy is sort of just sort of medieval sword and not much magic. And for the longest time, A Song of Ice and Fire sort of appears to be mostly low fantasy. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but in general, it's a very low magic world, right? For the majority of the first, even though there are obvious magical elements, they're sort of lurking in the background, right? Like they're coming, but they're not necessarily there.
Right. If you were to think about it just between those two categories and not include all the science fiction elements that we think are there, I think it's a low fantasy series with nods to high fantasy. But if you include the science fiction element to things, it makes it a lot more complicated, and you can finally see just how much it fits into that category.
And so, in a way, the hinge of is it fantasy or is it sci-fi is what gets revealed in the end. Because if it's sci-fi, ultimately, you kind of would like to know, where does the power that red priests have come from? Is there a drowned god? Does the drowned god have power? Because it frequently appears like possibly yes. And I think ultimately we're not going to get those answers in the books. And so I think that's what sort of lands it finally into the camp of fantasy. But it's not impossible that we do get some really big answers about like the gods, and that would be shocking to me. But it would definitely make it very much more science fictional. I don't know. Do you think that's likely to happen?
I'm very torn because I don't even know like if we can even consider any of these gods to be real.
Right.
Because Martin is agnostic at the very least. He's probably a nihilist based off of all of his other works. So why would he write, this war piece about a god that's actually real when most of his stuff is trying? Because he's very much a hippie. He grew up in the '60s, and so he's always written about how war changes people, and how a greater peace can be achieved in some way. So I don't I don't know. There's no way we can really know until the Winds of Winter and is it the Eternal Spring?
A Dream of Spring, I
A
think.
Dream of Spring. Until those books come out, we can only wonder,
A
basically.
Dream of Spring, by the way, was originally going to be titled A Time for Wolves. So that's something to chew on.
Okay. Okay. Time
Yeah.
for Wolves. All right. So maybe there is a happy Stark ending coming in
Yeah,
some
I'm
way,
curious
shape, or
because
form.
it's almost like with the philosophy of the show and the book, you would expect there to be very different endings. The show, I would almost expect to have a very dark, sort of all-consuming, unhappy ending, and the books I would expect to have a much more sort of bittersweet, things are lost, things are found, sort of, maybe happy in parts ending. So I'm curious how much of the book's ending maybe bleeds over to the show.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. Because, I mean, there are theories out there that I'm not going to talk about on this podcast because we'd be talking for hours more. That the book is going to end with everyone kind of joining the Weirwood net, like
Right.
Bran does, which are some of my favorite theories and kind of line up with all of Martin's other works. But we're not going to talk about those at least this time.
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole.
Maybe in another episode of Coddcast. But
Should we
uh,
explain that? Should we explain that name real quick?
oh yeah, we should have explained it.
So, House Cod, who I don't think we'll ever see on the show, but House Cod is a house on the Iron Islands whose house words are, "Though all men do despise us," and we meet pretty much only one character, Lucas Left Hand Cod, uh, who is pretty much mercifully made fun of, told, "Yeah, also all women despise you, buddy, but at least you still have your hand." And then Asha makes a jerk off motion at him. But they're this very very sad house who, it's just kind of hilarious because every other house in the book has these very noble house words, and their house words are like, you know what, we do all right. even though everybody hates us. So that's why I like House Cod.
And it works well because COD is part of podcast, and we can make the play on words there because nearly every other Game of Thrones
It was the
podcast has,
only title left.
yeah, it was basically the only title left. I got a very kindly worded tweet from the editor of MTV saying that, Game of Thrones is taken. And then also Brotherhood Without Manners was another one we wanted, but that's a pretty popular one. So kind of wrapping things up, do you have any predictions for either The Winds of Winter or the rest of season 6 or A Song of Ice and Fire in general about any character doing anything? Do you have just an overall prediction of what's going to happen for anyone?
Sure. Okay, one thing I think that's going to happen in The Winds of Winter that we might not see in like season 6 in the show is I think that the letter that Rob signed legitimizing Jon as his heir. You can go back in the book and find this. This did actually happen. Will turn up, and I think the houses of, not the houses of the North, but sort of the mountain tribes and the mountain clans, along with House Umber, House Manderly, will sort of unite under a legitimized Jon Stark. Because I think there's so much evidence of plotting going on with the Manderleys and the Mormonts that I think it all has to pay off in some kind of big way. The theory that I really like that sort of brings it all together is that Rhaegar's silver harp, which is a unique item that could identify him, is in the tomb of Lyanna Stark, and that's sort of the way that they would prove that Rhaegar and Lyanna were, actually in a loving relationship, and that Jon is the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna. And then with the letter from Robb, he's also he's a legitimized Stark, which makes him pretty much not only Lord of Winterfell, but also has a potential claim on the Iron Throne. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to play out the same way in the show, because they seem like they're maybe giving Sansa a bigger role in what's going on up north. But that's what I think is going to happen as far as all that Jon stuff. At least that's my hope. I think there's going to be a lot of Frey killing and revenge on the Boltons in the book. I'm desperately holding out for that to happen. So I really need that to happen.
Yeah, and I agree with you that letter probably will show up. There are some counter theories out there that believe that he didn't legitimize Jon, but he made Catelyn his heir, which is an interesting play on things. But yeah, I think if that letter shows up and they find the harp in Lyanna's tomb, then yeah, he's probably going to have a claim on the throne. There's going to be a war. People are going to die because that's Game of Thrones.
That seems likely. Although I think there's probably a fair amount of characters who are dead on the show now who are going to survive for a good long while.
Right. I guess my one prediction involves the Iron Islands and Dany. I think that Euron is going to end up with a dragon.
Euron is going to succeed where Quentin failed.
Yep. And I'm not even sure Quentin failed. It's very ambiguous in the books. But that's Game of Thrones. It's ambiguity and death, pretty much. So I think that'll do it for the first episode of Coddcast, though all men do despise us. I don't know when we're going to do another one. I said we would do another one after episode 10. But I guess it depends on what you and Paul are feeling if we do another one between now and then. But,
yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can come up with something to talk about.
Yeah. And
things are happening rapidly. So.
Right. And for those who are still listening and are watching currently, we are missing one of our recurring members, Paul Moses. Give some love his way. He just had his grandma pass away. So, yeah. I think I think that'll do it for us here today. Do you have any final thoughts, Will?
No, thanks for having me, man. This was a lot of fun.
I'll try not to call you Jesse next time.
There you go.
That was probably the worst opening to a podcast ever.
I thought it was hilarious.
Here with Jesse Eisenberg from the
Yeah, I'm here with
from
Lex Luthor
Zombieland,
himself.
right?
Yeah.
So, all right. Until next time, I'm Kyle. That's Will. We'll see you around.